Hi, my name is Josephine English Cook, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Today I'll be talking about the confluence between architecture, analogy, and 3D visualization in Michelangelo Antonioni's film The Passenger from 1975. In the last few years, new VR devices have accelerated immersive 3D experiences into the mainstream, combining haptic and visual approaches to the media screen. By engaging the eye and the body in virtual space-making ventures, such technologies have proven useful in fields as wide-ranging as film, architecture, journalism, and PTSD therapy. These virtual techniques arguably open up a new set of phenomenological possibilities, the ramifications of which have been debated in spheres as far-flung as political elections, Silicon Valley startups, and neuroaesthetics. This recent supposedly disruptive proliferation, however, can be traced back to earlier origins of virtual design, not only in the post-war developments of 3D video games and architectural software platforms, but also in the very fabric of film itself. The release of the first 3D video games, such as the space flight simulator SpaceSim in 1974, followed on the heels of the first 2D gaming console systems, developed for the market beginning in 1967. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, wireframe graphics had developed increasingly realistic landscapes, incorporating scenic elements like trees, bystanders, and airplanes along the racetrack in Speed Freak, and multidimensional movement across volcanic terrain and Battle Zone. 3D computer visualization was also a staple topic in architecture, engineering, and airspace design, leading from early 60s prototypes like Sketchpad to the innovations of CATIA, or Computer-Aided Three-Dimensional Interactive Application, first developed in 1977 and publicly expanded in the 80s. As the historian of architecture Antoine Picon has observed, these technological advances led to multiple paradigm shifts in the architectural field. Whether in response to Cold War crises and the rise of cybernetics, or as an engagement with new digital codes, semiotics, and language, computer culture inspired designers to attempt to fashion an increasingly artificial landscape into a positive force. These topics arose in other adjacent fields such as film, an under-discussed cross-section that highlights the need for more interdisciplinary studies of space, design, and the dissemination of ideas. Michelangelo Antonioni's The Passenger implements similar strategies and asks comparable questions. Written by Antonioni, Mark Peplow, and Peter Wolin, a filmmaker and theorist noted for his interest in semiotics, the film creates an architectural environment analogous to the programs of 3D design. Released in 1975, just a year after the first 3D game and 2 years before CATIA, The Passenger implements innovative camera work that creates a mobile embodied viewer, replacing fixed-point perspective with multiple points of view. By generating spaces in which the viewer can effectively see beyond the edges of the static frame, like in 3D visualizations, Antonioni dissolves traditional understandings of the cinema screen. This paper will situate The Passenger within this context of spatial design, as an indirect inheritor of architects' post-war computer discourse, and as a harbinger of current space-making technologies. The film disorients the viewer in a revolutionary and architectural experience of cinematic space. Set against a series of barren landscapes, The Passenger showcases the filmmaker's interest in alienating environments and technical flair. The film opens with the journalist David Locke, played by Jack Nicholson, as he attempts to complete a documentary about civil unrest in an unidentified African country. While on the job, he meets fellow Englishman David Robertson, a doppelganger whose unexpected death inspires Locke to steal his passport, adopt his identity, and pursue a series of meetings from the dead man's diary. This journey takes Locke to London, Munich, Barcelona, and beyond, where it's revealed that Robertson trafficked weapons for the same armed African rebels depicted in Locke's documentary. His adventures eventually lead to an encounter with a character known only as the Girl, played by Maria Schneider, whose free spirit contrasts with Locke's careful, objective, and removed journalistic approach. It is her advice that spurs him to continue Robertson's journey, to move out, in other words, from behind the camera and into the world, a journey that ends in Locke's demise at the hands of rebel gunsmen. Locke's demise in the penultimate scene is perhaps the film's most famous shot. As a 7-minute single take, this shot was made possible only through the innovative use of deft camera work and new technology. It is also noteworthy for its groundbreaking use of space and time, which shifts our attention from the two-dimensional cinema screen to the three-dimensional world within, With this in mind, the following paper will first situate the shot within the context of both Antonioni's inventions and the film's overarching narrative. It will then broaden its scope to address contemporaneous spatiotemporal concerns. How might the scene's innovative camera work complicate our reading of a screen as a two-dimensional space? So here I will play just a brief clip from this longer 7-minute single take. David Locke, the protagonist, is lying down on a bed just behind us, and at this point the camera has removed itself from his subjective point of view to a third person, much more abstract, so-called objective view, moving slowly towards the window grate and eventually out past into the sea and the crossroads behind. The female character we see straight ahead is the girl played by Maria Schneider. And pay attention too to the sway of the camera, as well as to the dislocation between the rigid bars and the more circular motifs of the crossroads and the bullring beyond. This 7-minute long clip begins with David Locke lying on a bed in the same room that the audience eventually leaves behind. Viewers of the full film will also recognize the brunette who reappears as the girl, and the two men who exit a car in the bottom left as rebels, one of whom will shortly kill the journalist. This climactic moment is only indicated by a soft but sudden gunshot, nearly hidden beneath the everyday sounds of the world outside. How do these camera angles, sounds, and narratives relate? The answer lies partly in Antonioni's oeuvre and partly in the passenger's own thematic structure. When it first premiered in 1975, the shot astounded contemporary critics with its movie magic. The shooting process involved 11 days, gyroscopes, and a special Canadian camera flown in after weeks of sandstorms and technical trial and error. It also proved confounding in its quizzical play with cinematic narrative. What actually is going on? How does Locke die? And who are these random extras, and what happens to them off screen? Left with such questions, many reviewers threw up their hands and proclaimed Antonioni either the most convoluted or transcendent of European art house directors. The Oscar-winning auteur was not unacquainted with controversy. The 1960 Cannes premiere of one of his earlier works, L'Avventura, famously resulted in Antonioni being booed out of the theater in tears. These ambiguous narratives have often been described by critics as alienating, uneasy, and full of ennui. Indeed, in most of his work, the director mixes vague storylines, industrial and barren landscapes, and obscure camera angles that forego subjective perspectives in favor of the dislocated, alienated angles of so-called Antony ennui. We can easily spot these formal strategies in this clip. We see, strange beyond the bars, the brief interaction between the disinterested girl and a rebel in the upper left, a car passing through the lower screen, an old man with a dog sitting against the far wall of the bullfighting ring, and the girl, having moved, standing near the center of the frame as the camera breaks free of the bars. Other figures in the full shot include a driving school car, a jogger, a boy who throws a rock at the old man, and a group of children. None of these vignettes, beyond the muffled gunshot, directly develops the previous 2 hours of plot. Instead, they serve as singular moments of everyday life, disconnected from each other and from any grand narrative. We can understand Locke's death within this disconnect. Early in the film, we come to know him as estranged from his middle-class London life, his failed marriage, and his unsatisfying journalistic career. In this light, his theft of Robertson's passport can be read as an attempt to escape both his body and his identity, to flee the prison of the isolated self. By literally embodying another, he tries to find new life by transcending a state of alienation. Locke's death, however, takes place in a foreign Spanish landscape in a small room enclosed by prison-like iron bars. In other words, his escape attempt has failed. Like so many of Antonioni's characters and post-war contemporaries, Locke too falls prey to his alienated state of being. Yet this reading fails to consider the shot's additional formal qualities, like its riveting rhetorical effects and affective plays. The depiction of the doppelganger, for example, was commonly used as a rhetorical trope by other post-war innovators, such as the author Patricia Highsmith. Highsmith, whose novels have been adapted for films ranging from Purple Noon to The Talented Mr. Ripley, wrote extensively on the themes of forgery and identity theft. Her first published novel was adapted by Alfred Hitchcock in his 1951 film Strangers on a Train, which, like The Passenger, features two look-alike characters who rely on identity confusion to attain a goal. Hitchcock's visual strategy, however, is different. In a number of famous shots, he incorporates elements of doubling. 2 taxicabs, 2 sets of feet, 2 train rails that cross twice, and tennis doubles. These visual metaphors underlie the story's emphasis on double-crossing and crossing one's double, as well as the mirror pairings of good and evil that Highsmith's characters are so often forced to choose between. One of Highsmith's follow-up novels from 1964, The Two Faces of January, revisits this double's conceit, but with a rhetorical twist. Rather than using metaphor to investigate her character's double nature, she implements the metonym, pairing together 2 men who attempt to escape their identity by falsifying passports. Antonioni would likely have known about Highsmith's work and incorporated the passport as a metonym for identity in The Passenger. Indeed, as an avid reader who often based his films on short stories, Antonioni cast the actor Alain Delon in a leading role in his 1962 film L'Eclisse, only 2 years after Delon had starred in the first and well-received adaptation of Highsmith's character Tom Ripley. Regardless of influence, The Two Faces of January and The Passenger share structural similarities, particularly in the use of rhetorical devices. Seymour Chapman, writing on Antonioni's earlier films of the 1960s, notes what he calls the filmmaker's frequent use of the metonym, especially in connection with architecture, which we can see here in a classic reading of the more traditional styles of architecture versus the newer construction, is comparable to the relationship between the younger daughter and the older father here. This rhetorical strategy is also at play in The Passenger, particularly in scenes that take place in Barcelona buildings by Antoni Gaudí. For example, halfway through the film, Locke and the Girl rendezvous at La Pedrera, a famous Gaudí work that features a rooftop filled with ceramic tile chimneys and anthropocentric forms. Using a visual analogy, the camera plasters Locke and the Girl against these fragmented tiles, while he tells her a fragmented version of his journey and ultimately asks for her help. This effect is mimicked in the camera work, as the conversation is conveyed only through divided, fragmenting eyeline matches, until the girl agrees to help, and the shot unites both figures as she becomes part of his journey. Something similar transpires in the penultimate shot, in which the camera, referencing Locke's desire to escape, moves from within the enclosed confines of a hotel and into the open desert crossroads beyond it. Like with Gaudí's tiles, the hotel and the crossroads operate as analogies, here as sites of transience. The hotel, like Locke's body, is a static, enclosed vessel in which the identities of its guest may change. This visual analogy repeats throughout the film, with Locke photographed against a hotel in every major city he visits, including his first location in an unnamed African country, which is architecturally similar to its parallel in the penultimate scene's minimal, whitewashed Spanish village hotel. These two analogous bookends, the first pre-passport switch, and the last near the end of Locke's life, showcase the endless, unattainable nature of his search for freedom. The crossroads, in contrast, is a mobile, open place of transport for joggers, cars, and school children, one in which multiple people can coexist unrestricted by walls. By moving outside the hotel and into the landscape, the camera thus attains in transit that freedom so desperately sought by Locke. Originally titled Fatal Exit by its semiotician screenwriters, the film argues that it is only by escaping the closed system of the body, of buildings, that autonomy might be gained. In a segment near the film's end, a tape recording of Locke is played back. In it, he ponders, wouldn't it be better if we could forget old places, forget everything that happens? What's on the other side of that window? What is on the other side of that window is the final subject of this paper. Through his unusual use of time, Antonioni's desert crossroads are imbued with a contemporary spatial rhetoric. By training his lens outside the window for a protracted duration, he generates a variation on what French critics had come to call temps mort, or dead time. Featured in his earlier films like L'Eclisse, This technique extends a shot of a subject or place that is secondary to the narrative, activating the subject or place with a new, non-narrative import. Like Warhol's long take of the Empire State Building, this shot gives these images a concrete materiality, a portrait-like existence beyond the fictions of the film. During an interview in 1975, Antonioni answered a question about the rhetoric of the shot, stating that, quote, "When I say I've tried to be more objective, I mean it in a technical way. I have replaced my objectivity with that of the camera. I can direct it any way I want. As the director, I am God. Actually, the liberty I have achieved in the making of this film is the liberty the character in the film tried to achieve by changing identity." End quote. Indeed, the camera movement that pushes past the grate and into the world is similar to Locke's desire to escape his body. But it is through displacing a subjective point of view that the camera is able to achieve, unlike Locke, Antonioni's mobile, objective liberty. It is this rhetoric of space that differentiates the shot. Rather than depicting Locke's point of view or a visual metaphor, the camera imitates the transient nature of the hotel and crossroads. By literally moving from one and into the other, it mimics the transitory attitude that is native to these spaces, rather than the subjective point of view of any character. This is no analogy, but an actuality, one in which the desert landscape increasingly becomes, through dead time, a concrete, material, embodied place. But to what end? Chapman posits that it enables us to understand the camera's movement as a carrier of Locke's soul to another post-life place, as a fulfillment of his desire, achievable only in depth, to escape the subjectivity of his own body. This echoes the sentiment of the younger character in Highsmith's novel, Rydal Keener, who, after losing his passport, ID, and ability to use his real name for fear of arrest, feels, quote, free, as only a nameless person of his time could be free. It was like being suspended in some element that did not really exist on earth, like the element in which angels flew or spirits communicated with one another, end quote. In other words, Antonioni implements a novel spatial rhetoric that allows us to understand passage into this landscape as an embodied and virtual versus just visual journey to the afterlife. This transition from visual rhetoric to embodied spatial rhetoric is mirrored in Locke's progression of architectural pit stops. These range from the industrial materials and gridded lines of Patrick Hodgkinson's Brunswick Centre in London, to the rounded, biomorphic forms of Gaudi's La Pedrera, to the slow collapse of structures into the landscape itself, whether in the low-to-the-ground blocks of a rural Spanish town, whose green shades mimic the scattered, scrawny brush in Locke's own shirt, or the Spanish cliff-top village of Sorbus, whose buildings merge with their base as if they were themselves rocky extensions. The girl, in a conversation immediately preceding the penultimate scene, traces the contours of Locke's profile. "Isn't it funny," she asks, "all the shapes we make?" Thereby culminating this architectural progression in a collapse, a conflation of rhetoric, man-made form, organic shape in the exterior of the human body. It is against this rhetorical backdrop that I propose a reading of Antonioni's long shot in light of its cinematic architecture. In contrast to critics who describe the passenger as convoluted, this shot's disorienting shifts initially establish a clear camera rhetoric that, when broken by the movement past the iron bars, generates a wholly new affective reading, in line with Locke's original pursuit of freedom. Might we better understand this film not purely in terms of alienation, but rather by its disorienting assimilation, by its haptic engagement with rhetorical space. In other words, it is in moving both through and within these landscapes that Antonioni ultimately flouts the forms of alienation. Once asked about his take on landscapes, and Antonioni replied that he saw them as, quote, always moving toward or away from a moment of crystallization. Such fluctuation, whether between rapid cuts and ton mort or the two-dimensional screen and the depth of the space within, can be detected in this particular penultimate scene. At the beginning of the shot, the frame contains a grated window with its side shutters pulled open. Beyond this frame is a vibrant, dusty backdrop, the contrast with the smooth wooden shutter, its fluid fabric drapes, and the repetition of the iron bar sheen. As the camera slowly draws us closer to the static, solemn prison bars, the erratic movements in the brightly lit backdrop become more pronounced. The barricade denies us entry into the scenes and sounds behind. Like Locke, our bodies are visually bound within this grated space, disconnected from the landscape behind. This unnerving disembodiment is echoed in the camera movement itself. As mentioned, Antonioni incorporates what he calls an objective camera. By this, he means an emancipated, scientifically objective viewpoint, unhindered by human subjectivity. In this way, the camera is able to be in the world, independent of individual identity, a trap that Locke, while alive, was never able to avoid, especially in his failed attempts at so-called objective journalism. Like the static framing and iron bars that restrict our view, so too is Locke limited by his outlook. At one point, he's critiqued by his wife for remaining unbiased in his reporting of an African dictator. At another, he's criticized by his so-called witch doctor who, during an interview, physically turns the camera around and claims that Locke's questions reveal more about the interviewer than the interviewee. But how does Antonioni flip the objective lens on the reporter? How does he achieve in the making of this film the liberty that Locke so desired? Like Locke's own objective journalism, this penultimate scene begins with a steady gaze as the camera moves forward, recording daily activities without interruption. As the camera approaches the grated screen, however, it begins to sway, both as if it's been affected by some outside source of wind and in rhythm with the girl's angled body. As the lens and our gaze approach the bars, we're both barricaded from and pulled into the effects of the exterior landscape. This tension is mirrored in the girl's roundabout wandering and swaying scaffolding, which contrasts with the bar's rigid grid, affirming her narrative role as the only character able to break free of a failed objective frame. But what do we make of this space, both Locke's and ours, as the camera finally pushes past that grated screen? An answer lies in the movement generated by the shot's formal qualities. Barthes, in a celebratory essay from 1980 entitled Cher Antonioni, describes the director's formal engagement with the screen as a unique feature of his work. Quote, "It is the alienness of the interstitial space created by his films that makes their bodies, landscapes, objects, indeed the screen itself, vibrate. The film's vibration, in other words, is that of an art object that is in the plenitude of its identity, and yet that also falls into a void because of an obstinate, subtle, open gaze that is directed to the world." End quote. This interplay between void and object is certainly at work in this shot. The foreground of gray breaks the background space into repeated rectangles of neutral, semi-abstracted color blocks. At times, the camera angle itself emphasizes this blocking, as the grate's bars align with the horizon line and columns of the bullfighting ring. This flux between positive and negative space is also evident, as Barthes points out, in the works of several artists in Antonioni's own collection, Matisse among them. Matisse's famous color space, for example, is sometimes generated by a similar flux between form and void. His open window couleur, for example, shows how the impasted blues, reds, and greens beyond the door frame can pop and appear as if they were actually on the surface of the painting itself. Antonioni's occasional color pops follow a similar pattern. The bright red of a young boy's shirt, for example, reads as if it too sits on the surface of the screen, as distracting as the matador's capote. We know, however, by way of diminished scale in the overlapping bar, that it of course exists in the background. The shot's interstitial vibrancy, which pushes the eye back and forth in depth, is balanced by a play between horizontal and vertical axes that lead our eyes to the edges of the frame. Take a look, for example, at the difference between the repetitive geometry of the iron grate and the circular motifs behind, including the bull rings, rondel, and the traffic patterns in the dirt. This divide highlights two distinct modes of representing space. First, the regimented Cartesian grid, a trope of Western picture making that emphasizes the surface of the canvas and screen, and second, a circular space that bleeds beyond the canvas borders. Indeed, cars enter, loop, and exit. The girl wanders, circles, exits, and returns again. It is precisely the circular 3D space that the camera engages when it finally breaks free of the Great's gridded cage. By pushing beyond the window frame, the lens explodes the metaphor of the picture as a window onto the world, literally becoming one with the world it purports to present. It breaks down, in other words, both the Cartesian grid and Descartes' dualism, dissolving the divide between body and mind. This centuries-long tradition of humanistic linear perspective disintegrates as the camera emerges beyond the grate, pans to the left, and swivels in a 180-degree rotation to look back from outside the bars on Locke's dead body. We see in nearly full view the everyday world these people inhabit, from a group of congregating school kids to a horse and buggy driving lazily along a road. This circular pan imitates the witch doctor's actions. By rotating the camera, Antonioni manifests his machine's objective viewpoint and flips it back on Locke. Albeit a Locke whose head is decapitated by the edges of the frame, his red shirt shadowed into black. Acting then as an embodied surrogate for sight, the camera achieves the very release from alienation that Locke can only achieve in death. Indeed, like Charon's voyage across the river Styx, the swaying camera's final push beyond the grates generates a euphoric afterlife sensation of floating being. By disorienting our bodily engagement with the screen's Cartesian grid, Antonioni's lens opens up a new field of phenomenological operations. In shifting spatial camera rhetorics, Antonioni establishes passage into virtual space. As an advanced parallel to 1970s video games and engineering software, the passenger's penultimate scene acts as a spatial analogy for not only Locke's embodied escape, but also for the emerging freedoms offered by new 3D design technologies, including the ability to pivot between multiple points of views on a single screen rather than drawing a multitude of static perspectival sketches, the analysis through animation of different part-to-whole systems, in this case the protagonist and his myriad surroundings, or the hotel room, the window, and the desert crossroads, the mechanical, technically objective visualization of space, and an emphasis on not only geometries, like the window's gridded bars and the bullring's curved walls, but also on materiality, on the changing lighting effects, color, and texture, the elements that together create an overarching sensorial effect. This theme, that new virtual spatial strategies can unlock novel freedoms, is shared between Antonioni's film and many contemporary 3D designers, revealing the ideological stakes of stepping into a space of representation.